In the year 1600, Japan was exhausted. For more than a century, the country had been trapped in an endless cycle of civil war known as the Sengoku era. Daimyo fought relentlessly for land, influence, and survival. Alliances formed only to collapse, and loyalty often lasted no longer than convenience allowed. Entire regions lived under constant mobilization, while villages were burned, harvests disrupted, and families displaced. By the end of the 16th century, Japan had reached a breaking point. Either the violence would finally be contained under a single authority, or the country would fracture beyond repair. The fragile stability that existed depended largely on Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rising from humble origins. Hideyoshi had unified much of Japan through military dominance and careful political balancing, yet he never assumed the title of shogun. Instead, he ruled through personal authority, controlling rival daimyo by distributing land, enforcing obligations, and keeping potential challengers in check. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a young heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and a council of regents tasked with governing until the boy reached adulthood. In theory, the arrangement was meant to preserve peace. In practice, it opened the door to renewed conflict. Among the regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood as the most powerful figure. He controlled vast territories in eastern Japan and had spent decades navigating the dangerous politics of the Sengoku world. Many daimyo believed Tokugawa was the only leader capable of imposing lasting order. Others feared that his rise would erase the Toyotomi legacy and threaten their own survival. Opposition coalesced around Ishida Mitsunari, a skilled administrator and committed loyalist to the Toyotomi house. Unlike Tokugawa, Mitsunari was not known for battlefield leadership, but for discipline, organization, and an unyielding belief in legitimate succession. As tensions grew, Japan divided into two competing camps. Tokugawa gathered eastern allies who favored stability or calculated that resistance was futile. Mitsunari rallied western lords who believed the Toyotomi family still represented legitimate authority, or who feared Tokugawa's consolidation of power. This was not simply a geographical split between east and west. It was a struggle over loyalty, succession, and the future structure of Japan itself. Each daimyo faced the same dilemma: choose a side, or risk being destroyed when the conflict was decided. Both factions marched toward Sekigahara, a narrow mountain basin in central Honshu. The location was chosen not for symbolism, but for strategy. Sekigahara controlled key routes, linking Kyoto and Osaka to the eastern provinces. Whoever held the valley could move troops, block supplies, and dominate the heart of the country. In an era where logistics determined victory as much as courage, Sekigahara was the perfect place for a decisive confrontation. On the morning of October 21, 1600, a thick fog settled over the valley. Visibility was poor, and banners vanished into the mist. Drums echoed across the hills as tens of thousands of soldiers prepared for battle. Mitsunari's western army occupied strong defensive positions on elevated ground. Tokugawa's eastern forces assembled below, appearing exposed and vulnerable. On paper, the western coalition seemed to hold the advantage, but Sekigahara was never meant to be decided by numbers alone. Long before the armies met, Tokugawa Ieyasu had already begun shaping the outcome. He understood a central truth of Sengoku politics: loyalty was fragile, and hesitation could be exploited. In the weeks leading up to the battle, Tokugawa sent messages to commanders on both sides. Some were promised land and rewards. Others were quietly warned of the consequences of opposing him. A few were simply reminded that when the fighting ended, only one side would control Japan, and mercy would be limited. When the battle began, confusion dominated the field. Arquebus volleys cracked through the fog, and spear formations clashed in muddy terrain. Units advanced without knowing whether neighboring forces would support them. Orders were delayed or misunderstood, and communication broke down as the fog thickened. For the soldiers fighting below, Sekigahara felt less like a planned engagement and more like chaos unfolding in real time. The Western Army was not a unified force, but a coalition of independent domains. Some commanders were fully committed to Mitsunari's cause. Others had joined reluctantly, waiting to see which side would gain the upper hand. Several key leaders hesitated, watching the battlefield carefully before committing their troops. Tokugawa's forces, by contrast, moved under centralized command, absorbing pressure while waiting for the coalition opposing them to fracture. The most critical moment of the battle depended on Kobayaka. Positioned on Mount Matsuo, Hideaki commanded troops that could strike either army's flank. Although he had declared loyalty to Mitsunari, his allegiance was uncertain. Tokugawa had contacted him repeatedly before the battle, offering rewards and hinting at severe consequences. As fighting raged below, Hideaki remained motionless, ignoring urgent signals from the Western Command. Mitsunari desperately ordered Hideaki to advance. Still, no movement came. Tokugawa then forced the issue. He ordered his gunners to fire toward Hideaki's position, a calculated provocation meant to compel a decision. Remaining still would signal weakness to both sides. Attacking Tokugawa meant committing fully to a coalition that might soon collapse. Attacking the Western Army offered survival and influence in a Tokugawa-controlled future. Hideaki chose betrayal. His troops charged downhill into the western flank. The impact was immediate. Western units broke formation to respond, and panic spread rapidly across the field. Once betrayal became visible, other commanders made their own calculations. Some switched sides. Others refused to advance. Even hesitation proved fatal. The Western coalition, built on fragile alliances, collapsed from within. By the afternoon, Ishida Mitsunari's position was lost. He fled the battlefield, only to be captured days later. Sekigahara ended in a single day, bringing more than a century of open warfare to a close. Yet Tokugawa Ieyasu understood that battlefield victory alone would not guarantee peace. Stability required structure. In the years following Sekigahara, Tokugawa systematically reshaped Japan's political landscape. Domains were redistributed to weaken potential rivals and reward loyalists. Castle construction was restricted, armies were limited, and movement was tightly controlled. Daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and leave their families behind as leverage. Rebellion did not disappear, but it became extraordinarily difficult to organize. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was appointed shogun, founding a military government that would rule Japan for more than 250 years. The Tokugawa shogunate ended civil war, not through trust or reconciliation, but through control, surveillance, and carefully balanced power. Peace followed. Roads improved, trade expanded, and cities grew. Samurai gradually transitioned from warriors to administrators. Culture flourished under stability, producing art, literature, and theater. Yet this peace came at a cost. Society hardened into rigid classes, political mobility narrowed, and dissent became dangerous. Order was maintained through obligation rather than freedom. Sekigahara marked the end of the Sengoku era and the beginning of a paradox. Japan achieved unprecedented stability by accepting strict control. The country traded chaos for discipline and uncertainty for predictability. In a fog-covered valley at the crossroads of Honshu, alliances shattered, patience prevailed, and Japan chose enforced peace over endless war. Sekigahara did not simply decide who ruled the country. It determined how Japan would live for generations.